it working?
Hello.
What happens if you become a world-class computer programmer, just as a deep learning program obviates human coders? What happens if you become a world-class orthopedic surgeon, just as stem cell therapy replaces the need to replace human joints? Clearly, being creative, knowing how to learn, being versatile will be very important to you. Being mentally agile, empathetic, and curious will be essential. You must be able to get the next big thing, no matter how complex. The first is a rich soup of skills that have robust value. You are learning to think hard and do things well. If your self-image includes faith in your own ability, based on experience, you are doing well. Good stuff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to 24 Hours of STEM. My name is Meghna from Team 3132, and I will be your host for the Energy Stream for the next 6 hours. Over the next 24 hours, people from around the world will present on interesting and thought-provoking topics associated with STEM and all FAIR's robotics programs. We want to be able to continue and share our appreciation of STEM even in times of international hardships. So thank you for joining us today. Now it is time to get into the next presentations that will be featured across the two streams, math and energy, for the next 24 hours. So sit back, relax, and get ready to learn about STEM. Just so that everyone knows, this is the energy stream. So moving along, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker who will be talking to us about neural networks in FRC. Please welcome Yashas Ambati and Gabe Hart from Zebracorns. Hello. Hello, how are you guys today?
Doing well, how are you?
Thank you.
Good, I'm good. I'm really excited for what you got for us. Are you guys ready?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, take it.
Whenever you are.
Okay. Thank you to everyone tuning into our presentation tonight. So tonight we'll be looking at like a gentle introduction to neural networks and some use cases in FRC. I'm Yashas.
I'm Gabe.
And we are the vision leads on Team 900. And Marshall and Kevin are two of our wonderful mentors who helped us with this presentation as well.
We are based out of the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics in Durham, North Carolina.
Okay. So tonight we'll be starting with a brief overview of neural networks. So looking at the foundations of neural networks, and then we'll move on to some use cases of neural networks in the FRC world. So we'll be looking at a couple of a good use case, a use case where neural networks are not so much useful, and a unconventional but also effective use case. We'll also end with a sort of machine learning quick start. So we'll try to give some resources to get started with machine learning, as well as a couple of tips and advice from our own experience as well.
Yes, we want you to go and try this stuff for yourself. This is a case of, yes, please do try this at home.
Yes, definitely. Right. So we're going to start today with just looking like an overview of neural networks. So we have a little joke down there. We considered taking the brain out of a pigeon, but we concluded that might violate Rule R8. But no, in all seriousness, a neural network is basically just a layer of neurons. So a neural network looks something as it is drawn to the right, where we have layers of neurons, which are basically just nodes in this structure. So we have a layer that's an input layer. We have a couple of hidden layers, and the number of hidden layers is somewhat arbitrary. And then we also have an output layer, which will basically tell us the result of the neural network.
To make this a little bit more concrete, one example of what could be a hidden layer, for example, is like, let's say we were trying to classify images, trying to identify what's in an image. Your input layer, you might have one of those neurons for every pixel in your input image.
Right. And so going off of that example with when we're talking about images and where every pixel might be a input to a neuron, basically, if we just think of these pixels as going from their values ranging from 0 to 1, where 0 is basically a black pixel and a 1 is a white pixel. So here we're just talking about black and white and binary images. So we basically can think of these nodes also, their values that they hold ranging from 0 to 1. And this would be called their activation. So if their values are closer to 1, that means they're more activated than if their values are closer to 0. And basically in this structure, the values of a node basically flow throughout the entire, they flow through each layer in the network. And individual neurons are connected to neurons in the next layer through a series of edges which have weights assigned to them. So basically that weight will tell how much the output of one neuron affects the activation of the neuron that it's connected to in the next layer. And changing the weights is kind of how this is basically how this neural network learns. So it learns to find an optimal set of weights to basically figure out the function that maps all the input data to the output data.
And in order to do this efficiently, like in software, the way this is actually implemented, you don't have some sort of object for each and every one of these neurons in these layers. Instead, it's done with matrix multiplication by these weights between the layers in order to actually implement that. If you're curious to know more about that, we link to some resources at the end that you can look into.
Mm-hmm. And basically, just to give a little bit more intuition about neural networks, is this specific type of neural network that you see to the right here is sometimes known as a multi-layer perceptron. So there are a couple different names that you can call each of these like nodes in the neural network. You can call it a neuron, but you can also call it a perceptron. And basically, it's called a multi-layer perceptron because it is composed of different layers of neurons. And I guess you might be thinking, neurons, I've heard that somewhere, and the reason for that is because these structures they're biologically influenced. So they're inspired by the human brain. Okay, so why would we use a neural network? Why wouldn't we just use traditional statistical methods? Well, consider this example to the right of this small XKCD short. And it basically shows a boss kind of telling a computer programmer to basically write some code to check whether a photo is a bird, or to basically a user would upload a photo and they want the programmer to write some code to check whether the photo is a bird or not. So basically to us, this is a very trivial problem. We can look at a picture and immediately know that it's a bird or any other sort of animal. But for computers, this is a little bit more harder for computers. It turns from a trivial problem to a very complex one if we were trying to get a computer to know this. And this is where neural networks comes in. So neural networks, the goal of a neural network is to capture associations and uncover regularities. So given a bunch of data, it can figure out different patterns in that data that allow it to approximate a function to map some input to some output. So in this case, it would map basically all the input, which are just maybe the pixels of that picture, it'll map all those pixels into an output. So whether it's a bird or not. So yeah, so these are really useful when relationships between variables are difficult to describe. So we can't really describe why we knew that picture was a bird, and because of that, it's really hard to code. It's really hard to teach a computer to do that. But with neural networks, it's able to find these relationships that often are difficult to describe for even us. And the problem that neural networks basically mitigate that conventional techniques are often plagued of is that assumption of linearity. So that assumption that there is some linear function that basically can take that input data and give us output data. And oftentimes it's not. It's more dynamic and less deterministic than conventional techniques.
And just to reiterate here, the really powerful thing that a neural network's doing, the thing that allows it to do things like tell you that an image is a bird, is that the tools that we use to create these neural networks allow you to take a bunch of data and sort of computationally pull relationships out of that data rather than having to try to sit down and write a whole bunch of pixel by pixel rules to determine whether an image is a bird.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly what Gabe said. So these relationships are really, really convoluted. It's not something that you can like just know. So yeah, and like we'll see in a couple of in the next few slides that the process and these neural networks can basically learn. They start pretty dumb. They're pretty dumb neural networks. It's as if they're maybe just randomly telling us it's a bird or not. But they, with data and with time, they're able to learn that relationship and basically give us good answers.
Before we get into quite how it does that, though, we're going to move on to taking a look at the sort of two different broad categories of problems that we can do with a neural network. And we already have talked about one of them just now, which is classification, where you sort of sort your input into one of multiple categories. Maybe you have letters and you're trying to write an optical character recognition program that categorizes which letters those are. Or maybe you're trying to sort images into birds and not birds.
Yep. So what Gabe described was a classification problem. There are also regression problems. So these are more continuous problems. It's where the neural network might learn a function to fit a certain data set. So an example of this is weather prediction. So weather predictions are based on, let's say, years and years of previous data. So a regression problem, what it would do is it would take a bunch of data from, let's say, the past year, a bunch of weather data from the past year, and it would use that to fit a function to it. And based on the function, it could predict the weather for, let's say, the next day. And this is sort of illustrated in this diagram to the bottom left, to the bottom right, sorry. So the left is a classification problem. So where we have different data points, and basically we need to classify these data points. So all the teal data points are in one class, so we can call those birds. And all the green data points are in a different class, so we can call them not birds. And what a neural network doing classification problem would do is it would basically find a function to be able to segment this data into the two different classes. So be able to tell where if a point lies below that function, then it would, let's say if we predict this function, and then if a point lies here, the neural network will return that it's a bird. Or if it lies up here where there's more green, then it would say that it's not a bird. Similarly, we also have to the right, we have an example of a regression problem where given a bunch of data, it's able to find a function that basically fits the data. Here, it's really simple. It's just a linear function that fits this data that basically has a positive relationship. Okay.
Now let's move on taking a look at how it actually does that. And we already mentioned that it you feed it a whole bunch of data. And I just want to reiterate that again, because that is probably, if you only take away one thing from this presentation, it's that in order to make a neural network actually do anything, you need a lot of data and you need good data.
Yeah, so like the first line in the slide says, networks are hungry. They need a lot and a lot of data to be able to determine that function that maps the input to the output. And the way a neural network can basically, so in a previous slide, we talked about how the neural network learns by basically tweaking those weights. So it's getting closer and closer to the answer that we expect it to. But the problem is the neural network, we can't just tell the neural network that it's doing a bad job. It needs to know how to tweak those weights in order to get to the correct answer. And the way it does that is it needs to know how bad it's doing, right? So we can use something called a cost function to tell the neural network how bad it's doing. So this cost function, the higher the value is of the cost function, the worse the network is doing. So therefore, the goal of the neural network would be able to minimize this function. So to the right here, we have an example of a cost function. So this is actually a pretty simple cost functions. Cost functions get really complex and have many dimensions. But this particular cost function, or it can be called a loss function as well, can be modeled as a plane in 2D space. And let's say we start at one of these red peaks. So this would be like basically just starting with like random weights. The neural network has no idea what it's doing. What we want to do is we want to get the cost function to one of these happy minimums. So one of this really small like blue areas. So where the function is returning a really small value. And you can kind of think about the process of getting from this peak all the way to this local minimum where it's actually doing, the neural network's actually doing really well, like kind of like a ball rolling down a hill. So if you were to start a ball at this red peak, it would roll down into one of the local minimums. And kind of like that, that's the neural network tries to basically be the ball. So it tries to minimize that cost function. And the method of, I guess, getting to this local minimum is called gradient descent. And how, without getting too caught up in the language there, basically what gradient descent is that we feed the neural network some data. And based on the current weights, it'll get an output. And based on how bad it did, it'll then go back. It'll find which direction it needs to move on the cost function, so how to get to that local minimum. And based on that, it'll adjust the weights adjust all the weights in the neural network. And then you just keep on repeating this process with more and more data.
So this sounds happy and lovely, but now we're going to take a look at some places where this can perhaps not go quite the way we want it to. Some potential pitfalls you can run into as you throw data at your neural networks.
So this is where the road gets bumpy. So there are a couple of things you need to watch out for when you're trying to train a neural network. One of the biggest things is something called overfitting. So in this, you basically have trained your network so much, or your network has so many weights that the network can basically memorize the training data. So it knows exactly, given a piece of data, it can literally just give you the output based on what it's seen. It can't really generalize to data that's never seen before. It's basically memorizing what it knows and then giving an output based on that. So before we move on to the next bullets here, I'd like to turn your attention to the diagram, to the three little XKCD shorts again in the bottom right-hand corner. The first graph all the way to the left is basically a network that's been underfitted. So it's basically found a linear function to a set of data, but that function doesn't really fit to the data, not really. The second one is it's found another function that fits pretty well to the data. And I would say that it generalizes to that data pretty well. And then you have the last graph, where the function that it's found is literally the data. So it's basically memorized all of the data points in the data set, and this is bad. So what you should take away from this is that a bigger network with so many more weights, while it intuitively sounds like it might do a lot better, is actually it's not a better network, because it can lead to this problem of overfitting. And another thing about, yep, go ahead, Gabe.
I was to say, just moving on, that or actually, there's one more thing you need to cover up there. My bad.
Yeah. So another thing about overfitting is the data that you test your network on. So you never want to test your data. You never want to test your neural network on the training set, because that's what it's learning from. You want to test it on data that it's never seen before. That gives you a general idea of how well your network is generalizing to a number of data points that it's never seen before. And this is a good measure to basically tell how good your network is doing.
So then the other big problem you can run into is having an unrepresentative or otherwise flawed data set. And there's a saying, garbage in, garbage out, and that is perhaps no more true than with neural networks. Let's go back to our classification problem with birds. Suppose I'm trying to train my neural network to identify birds and not birds. If I only give it images of birds and no images of not birds, no images that don't contain birds, then it's not going to be able to differentiate, because the images that are not birds are not represented in the input data. Another thing that can occur is, even if you do have all, say, classes represented, your representatives of those classes are biased. Say 90% of my pictures of birds are penguins. Might be really good at identifying penguins as birds, but if you go and point it out the window here in North Carolina, where we don't have any penguins, and instead have like little songbirds and stuff, it's not going to do a great job. So the quality of the solution that you get out of your neural network is directly dependent on how good the data that you feed it is.
Yeah, and this is something that we can't stress enough. So when we implemented neural networks on our robot, we really made sure that we had really good data to feed into the neural network. And this is really important. Your neural network is only as good as your data, just like Gabe said. Okay, so now we're going to look at how do I neural network? So we have a couple of tips when implementing neural networks on your own. And the biggest one here is, don't try to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of network architectures that have already been made for certain use cases. And we suggest that you explore these and you definitely try those, rather than trying to immediately create your own custom neural network. And there are also some frameworks to help expedite the process of creating a neural network. And so specifically, we use TensorFlow, and we recommend TensorFlow wholeheartedly. But there are a lot more, there are many more different frameworks that you can use. Another big one is known as PyTorch. And there's also many others. So there's other ones like Caffe and there's a bunch of different frameworks to use.
Yeah, it's about the size of that. Don't worry if you don't know Python. There are ones for other frameworks. Just happens that the most popular ones are Python based. But now we're going to move on to taking a look at use cases in FRC. We've introduced this fantastic hammer that is the neural network. Let's take a look at some nails you might be able to hit with it.
And as one of our mentors used to say, neural net all the things. I
believe this was specifically in response to a certain neural net project from this season that you'll be finding out more about in just a moment. One of the best uses of neural networks, the sort of classic applications, is object detection. And this is extremely useful in FRC for a variety of reasons, detecting game pieces and field elements. And this year, we implemented an object detection system, like Josh has said, using TensorFlow. One of the most important parts of this was preparing the data. We had several people spend weeks going through hundreds and hundreds of images of the field for this year. And you can see one of these images here on the right-hand side of the slide, labeling the various things in that images, labeling all of the game pieces and the field elements that we wanted to detect. And this is the most time-consuming step. We're then able to use transfer learning, which is where you take a model, a sort of more generic model. In this case, we used one that's pretty popular in various object detection applications. And then we train it some more specifically for our use case. So on our data, to then get it fine-tuned to our specific application. And this is the part that takes the most computing resources, but a lot more person hours than CPU hours went into this system. As I said, the hard part here is getting good data and lots of it.
Yeah, and that second bullet of where we started with a pre-trained model and fine-tuned for our purposes goes with, again, with the idea of not reinventing the wheel. We used a proven model for our object detection system, and that really helped. So we have a quick video that shows the result of our object detection system that we would like to show you. So I'm going to try to play that here. Let me skip ahead a little bit to the interesting parts. There we go.
Oh, and it's worth noting, by the way, that this video was published by another team. We did not actually get to play a match this season, but we have been testing our models on video from videos that we've been able to obtain from other teams of the field, as well as actually the intro videos from FIRST.
Yeah, so I guess I'll pause. I'm going to go back a little bit and pause there. So our specific object detection model was actually trained to analyze an image and basically identify multiple different objects on the field, not just one. So we were able to identify different dynamic objects, such as objects that move, such as the fuel cells, and also some static objects, like the power port and some of the logos on my wall. And we also kind of train our network to look at some things that you wouldn't, necessarily think of a training network to look at. So, for example, this red tape corner and the blue tape corner.
That's one of the biggest things, actually, as to why this is a useful thing to do, right? Some of you are probably thinking, well, we've already have the retro tape on the field for identifying stuff. But once you have object detection, it sort of really opens up your possibilities for what it is that you can identify on the field. So now transitioning to what's a case where maybe a neural network is not the right tool for the job. We came across something recently where someone was trying to make use of neural network for processing encoder data from motors, essentially make an odometry system. And the problem here is that neural networks, they're not magic, right? There must be a learnable function between the input and the output. So if you tried to do odometry with a neural network, you'd have just that. You'd just have odometry. You wouldn't be able to do the things they were trying to do, like compensate for wheel slippage, because that's not something that you can really know from encoder data. If there's no relationship between the output and the input, there is no function that the neural network can learn. So an example of this would be trying to predict the weather based on what I eat for breakfast. There is no function relating what I eat for breakfast to the weather. However, there is some relationship between what I choose to wear when I go outside and what the weather is. So that would be something that does have a relationship between the input and output. But now we're going to take a look at a case where neural networks are a surprisingly good tool for the job, but maybe not something you would first have thought of. I assume we're probably all familiar at this point with the control panel in this year's game, that big spinny wheel with the 4 different colors on top that we need to detect. And we have a color sensor pointing down at the top of that wheel, or actually up from the bottom at it, and we need to be able to detect those colors. Now, the color sensor that we have actually has 6 channels. I think it's like red, green, blue, yellow, orange, and violet, something like that. Anyway, we get continuous value input from those 6 color channels, and based on that, we need to classify the data from the color sensor into one of 4 possible colors. So this is a classification problem. On a vector of known size of float value data, this is a great candidate for a neural network. And as it happens, when we implemented it, it worked well for classifying the colors and was able to learn the relationships between these various channels, even under different lighting conditions and such. So this is actually a really good candidate for use of neural networks. The big thing here that we want to emphasize is both this slide and the last one is to think outside the box for what you can use this tool for. It's a really powerful tool, and there's a lot that you can do with it. But while you're doing that, also consider whether or not the problem that you're trying to apply neural networks to is a good candidate for this tool.
Yeah, and one thing we like to say about this is consider the nature of your input and the nature of the output that you want. And based on this, you can figure out if you want to, if the problem is suitable for a neural network or not.
So how, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say that the next section is how can you get started at home? So this is kind of one of the things that we do want you to try it at home. And we're going to basically introduce some resources and some tips and tricks that we found over time while we were implementing it for other people to get started as well. So there are a lot of good resources on the internet to learn about neural networks. But there are a couple that we've compiled that are a very gentle introduction to it. So one such amazing YouTube series by YouTuber 3Blue1Brown, there is an amazing YouTube series on neural networks, which basically looks at the mathematics behind neural networks. So it starts with just motivating a neural network all the way into gradient descent and other steps within a neural network's training. There are also more advanced learning resources, such as Stanford's computer vision course using AI. And the framework we use, TensorFlow, they have their own set of tutorials using TensorFlow to implement various neural networks. And a plug for us, but we encourage you to also read our white papers. So we have as Gabe mentioned before, we have a white paper on the neural network that we implemented for color sensing, and we have a couple of other white papers that look at neural networks. And we'll talk a little bit more about our white papers in a future slide.
All of them can be found at this URL here, though.
Yeah. So we encourage you to take a screenshot of the slide. I'll keep it up for about a few seconds. We encourage you to take screenshots of the slide. These are very good resources.
And yeah, so the 3Blue1Brown series, can't recommend that highly enough. It's great if you want to get a sort of introduction how neural networks function under the hood without feeling like you're drowning in calculus.
Yeah, it's really gentle, and after watching it, they seem almost intuitive. So which is really cool. Okay.
All right, so do I need to go steal a data center from Google to run my neural networks, or do I need to have a computer with a zillion-dollar GPU and RGB lights that screams gamer? No, we actually managed to run our neural network for the color sensor on a potato.
Gabe, I think you mean RoboRio.
Wait. Okay, yeah, sorry, I got confused. On the RoboRio. But that said, and that was because, that was a fairly small neural network. There were less than 100 of those weights that we talked about, those connections between neurons in that entire network. And that's because, right, it only had 6 inputs, and it was trying to classify into one of 4 categories. So it was really small. We were able to package it up to run on what I have been informed was RoboRio. But that said, if you're trying to do things like more complex object classification tasks, a GPU will potentially make your process faster. We used the NVIDIA Jetson platform as a coprocessor on our robot for running computer vision, and we have a desktop with a GPU that we use to train our neural networks. For getting started with using a NVIDIA Jetson platform, if that's something you're interested in, we encourage you to check out our white paper on the Jetson Nano.
Yeah, and the Jetson platform is really great because they have systems that range from the Jetson Nano, which is relatively inexpensive, to more powerful systems as well.
This isn't to say that you need a GPU, by the way, in order to do neural networks. We encourage you to just go ahead and try this and see what you can do on whatever hardware you've got. But if this is hardware that you have access to, it might be worth using. So is this hard? Is this really difficult to get started with? No, it's not. For more detail on how this code works, to see an explanation of this exact code, where this came from, check out the TensorFlow tutorials that we linked earlier. But because these packages, these libraries such as TensorFlow, kind of abstract away all of the sort of mathematical parts that we talked about earlier, it actually becomes, in this case, more like sort of just kind of putting together those layers, almost like stacking up Legos, that it's this is a classifier for handwritten digits, so a sort of small optical character recognition task in like 20 lines of code, including line wraps and blank lines, or 15 I think we've got here. So it's not difficult to get started with.
So we'd like to give an update about what we're doing with neural networks on our team. So we have a white paper that's in the works right now that'll basically delve into more about our object detection system, and also some exciting ways we're making use of this object detection system. So how we're using that output to aid in other processes on our robot. And we also have another neural network of how to run neural networks on your potato. And that can be found on our website. And we have a white paper on that as well. Another thing that we're excited about announcing is that we're open sourcing our data set that we use to train our object detection system. So this data set is pretty big. It's in the order of 1,000, so I think it's closer to 2,000 images if I'm not wrong. But yeah.
So these are the images that we talked about earlier that our team spent a whole bunch of time labeling earlier this season. And by open sourcing this, we are doing this because we believe that open sourcing our data sets is going to be the way that we collectively as an FRC community are able to move forward with and explore and develop this technology. Data is such a high barrier to climb, and one of the most important sort of aspects and really prerequisites to being able to develop a neural network system, that we believe that if we as a community open source our data sets, then we will all be able to move forward much faster and do much more exciting things with the technology available to us. So this will be coming in the near future. So keep an eye out for our data, and we look forward to seeing what you do with it.
Yeah, and when this paper does come out, it will be available on that website that we had a few slides earlier about, the Zebracorns Labs website. It should be there when it does come out. So stay tuned.
I'd like to thank our sponsors that make what we do possible, particularly the ones that you see here. And also, I'd like to give a special shout out to NVIDIA because of the Jetson platform that we mentioned just a few slides ago that enables us to run so much of this stuff on the robot. And with that, we are going to go ahead and open up the floor for your questions.
All right, thank you for that cool presentation. I actually learned pretty cool things. So we do have some questions. First questions, how do you identify whether data is good or bad?
So that's a really important question. And I guess there's sort of two things that you can mean by that, right? There's how do you identify whether a certain problem is a good candidate for solving with the neural networks. And then there's how do you identify whether a specific data set is good for your problem. In both of those, unfortunately, there's no sort of formula that you can plug your data or your problem into that says, yeah, this is a great data set to try to use neural networks with, or no, this is terrible. There's sort of a bunch of factors that you kind of have to take into account. Some of those are whether there's a relationship between the data and the variable that you're trying to predict. Whether your data can be represented as that sort of vector that neural networks like to have as inputs. All of these sorts of things that we're feeding as inputs ultimately get sort of broken down into a vector of floating point values, right? There's whether or not you have enough data and whether or not the data that you have adequately represents the what you will be trying to measure in your actual application. And there's no sort of magic number threshold for these. Sometimes you have to just try it and see and do experimentation and find out what problems come up. So I wish we had an easy answer for that one. Unfortunately, there's no easy answer, but that's the question that we want all of you to be asking when you think about using a neural network for something.
Yep, makes sense. Second question, how do you pick network architectures?
I think maybe Yashis can speak a bit more to this one.
Yeah. So I'll bring it back to the specific the architecture that we use for object detection. And the reason we chose it is this specific model has been proven in, within the research community and also in previous literature. And really, most of these models, they've been so this is specifically an object detection model, and it has been experimented with, and it has been run on other object detection data. And we know that because it works well on that, we can fine tune that model for our purposes as well. And you can kind of tell whether that model will fit your problem by again, considering, what is the input that you want to give to your neural network and what do you want to get out of it? And then look at what that model does when it was experimented with at first. So what kind of input were they giving it, and what kind of output were they giving it as well? And based on that, you can kind of figure out if that model would work for your specific use case.
Cool. And last question, what's a good way to learn about neural networks?
Take a look at those resources that we had on that slide earlier, particularly if you want to learn a bit about how they work kind of underneath the hood, what that math that we were mentioning earlier looks like in practice. Highly recommend the video series from 3 Blue 1 Brown. And then if you want to start actually implementing neural networks yourself, I recommend using TensorFlow. There's some excellent tutorials on their website, and particularly if you know Python, it's an excellent way to get started with neural networks.
Yeah, and these things are easily Googleable. You can, for the 3 Blue 1 Brown video, you can just hop onto YouTube and search up 3 Blue 1 Brown neural networks, and it should pop right up. It's an entire series of 4 or 5 videos. I'm not sure how many. Yeah, but that's an amazing resource. And then for the TensorFlow tutorials, you can just Google that as well. It should pop right up.
Sorry, we do have more questions. Next question, why stop at image processing? Why not do end-to-end ML? That is sensors to motor commands all in one go.
That's an interesting question. And I think this comes back to sort of what we were talking about earlier with cost functions and how machine learning and neural networks are not magic. So in order to train a neural network, you need to be able to quantify essentially how bad the job it's currently doing, what its output is. And that, I think, would be very hard to create a cost and function when there's sort of such a complex set of circumstances for how well it's doing, I guess. See, with image processing, your cost function is very easy. It's a combination of did it get it right and how certain was it of its prediction. And the other thing is that, again, it's not magic. You can, when you have this sort of very complex chain of events between sensors and the various decisions that need to be made, because at that point, you're not just factoring in the behavior of the motors based on the sensor inputs. If you're trying to create something that will make the motor outputs to win a game, you're having to essentially be training it in strategy and the rules at the same time. And you end up with such a complex chain of causality that it's not really possible for it to come up with, to sort of even make any headway on pulling that function out between the input and the output. So that's a good point, that just because such a function exists in theory doesn't mean it's necessarily findable, even by a neural network.
Yeah, we did say that in theory, neural networks can approximate any function, but this comes with some caveats. And if you're interested, while neural networks specifically can't cater to that task that Gabe was saying about making decisions to win a game, there are other branches of machine learning and artificial intelligence that do cater to this part. Specifically reinforcement learning and other branches that they're cool, but they're beyond the scope of this presentation.
All right, so next question, how much data is enough for a training set?
Slightly more than however much you have. You want to have as much data as you can. In all seriousness, that's really hard to know beforehand. You try to get however much you can and use as much as you can, and then see if it works. And if it seems like you're having problems with overfitting or an unrepresentative sample, you try to get your hands on some more data.
Yep, more data is always better.
Yep. And last question, what's the future of neural networks on FRC?
So I think there's sort of two answers to this question. And I want Yash just to go ahead and take the first one here, which is sort of what the future is of our use on Team 900 of neural networks and FRC, where we're trying to go.
Yeah, so one of our major components of our machine learning implementation on our robot is, of course, that object detection system. And that system gives us a lot of data, right? So it gives us, it can basically give us different positions of different static objects all around our robot. So at least what the cameras on our robot can see. And we're able to kind of figure out where these static objects are relative to the robot. And what's really cool about that is if we're able to reference our robot to a set of static objects on the field, we can effectively localize the robot on the field. So based on the static objects around the field and where they are relative to the robot, we can kind of tell where our robot is absolutely on the field. So whereas odometry is kind of a relative relative measure of where the robot is on the field. So it's relative to, let's say, your starting point. So wherever you initialize your odometric system from. So it's relative to that arbitrary origin, whereas a localization tells us exactly where a robot is using an absolute coordinate system. And that's really cool moving forward. And that brings us one step closer to, you know, that idea of that fully autonomous robot. And that's really exciting.
I'd also like to present the sort of other answer that I see to the question of what the future of neural networks and FRC is. But before I do, just want to go ahead and echo what Yasis is saying. This is a system that we're incredibly excited about, that Yasis and I have spent months working on at this point, trying to make use of this data to localize the robot on the field. And we will be able to find more about what actually is under the hood there, how it is, and what it will be this summer that ZebraVision might briefly mentioned earlier. But while we still have time here, it looks like we have a bit more time. I'd like to mention the other answer I see to what the future of neural networks and FRC is, and that is whatever you all decide you want the future of neural networks and FRC to be. And that gets back to why, because we want everyone to try out new things, to try new ways to use this data, to try neural networks for unconventional applications, such as the color sensor, such as things we haven't thought of yet. I think that the future of neural networks in FRC will depend on the creativity of the people using them, of you, the teams, and also of the data that we're able to obtain to train those networks off of. Because at the end of the day, creating systems based on neural networks is most importantly an exercise in data curation.
And another thing with that is what Gabe was talking about when we talked about open sourcing our data. It's very much a collaborative effort between throughout the entire FRC community. And we think that we'd be able to advance where neural networks are in the world of FRC through collaboration, through data sharing, through ideas, through exploration. And this is what we hope to see in the next, the next era of FRC.
Cool. And I think I have one more quick question. Why are we detecting so many different objects on the field and not just the goal?
Yes, so we already kind of addressed that a little bit with our localization system. That's sort of the biggest thing here, right? If we think about the field this year, there's retroreflective tape at this end and retroreflective tape at this end, but nothing really in between with any tape on it. And in order to be able to use these static field elements to beacon off of them for localization, we need to be able to see them. We don't have a camera that can see everything all at once. Our cameras have limited fields of view. So the more objects there are on the field that we can use as beacons for localization, the more of the time we're going to be able to use this system, and also the better it's going to be able to perform. Also, secondarily, detecting game pieces could potentially allow us in the future to consider doing things like developing systems related to targeting game pieces.
Yeah.
The
And
more you can detect, the more possibilities you have with what to do with it, right?
yeah, that's honestly the answer. We chose to detect so many things because it opens up doors, and we could use that plethora of data that we're getting from the network in many different ways. And that's why we also chose to look at static elements such as logos and goals and stuff like that, and also tape targets. And we also looked at dynamic things on the field, such as other robots and fuel cells rolling around, because we can use both of these types of data in different ways.
All right. One more question. What types of augmentations are you guys using?
So this is an interesting question. So we kind of talked about how a neural net, you need a lot of data for training a neural network, and sometimes you don't really have that much data. So what augmentation is referring to is kind of using the data that you have to basically create synthetic data sets. So data sets that are not real, but they could be real based on the data that you have available. I don't think we've explored with any augmentation strategies so thus far, just because there's a lot of data to choose from, and we ultimately ended with like a data set of like closer to 2,000 images, which we feel like resulted in a pretty good object detection system. So we were pretty happy with that.
The one thing to keep in mind with augmentation, I know we already mentioned this, but I think it is worth repeating again. If you decide to do something like that, make sure that your augmentation system is producing good data. There might not really be a way to know whether or not the data it's producing is good or useful until you try training a network on it and seeing how it performs. But if the data from however you're augmenting your data is not representative or otherwise, biased in some way, it might actually make your neural network worse. So you got to make sure that your neural networks are not just getting enough to eat, but that they're eating a healthy diet.
Right. So you really have to consider the pros and cons when looking at a data augmentation strategy. And also you have to consider what type of data you're augmenting. It's really hard to augment, camera data, right? For instance, so you have to kind of consider what data you're looking at, and then kind of figure out if that data is augmentable. If you augment that data, will it make it worse or better? And as Gabe said, that kind of just comes with iterating and experimenting. So.
Right. All right. I think that's about it. Thank you so much for your time. That was pretty cool what I just learned. Yeah, thank you. Any
Thank you
questions?
for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you for having
good.
us.
All good. All right. All right, so on to the next one. I think our next speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker who will be talking to us about how new drugs and vaccines are discovered. Please welcome Diana Quinley from Centenary Institute. Hello,
Hi there.
how are you going?
Not too bad.
Yep, I'm really interested in what you're talking about today. So,
Oh.
yeah.
I looked at the schedule and I thought, oof, this is a bit left field, but hopefully something different will be good too.
No, yeah, I'm really excited. Yep.
Okay.
Do you want to take it away?
Yep, I'll share my screen.
Thanks.
Sorry, let me try that again. There we go. Cool. Okay, does that look okay?
Yep, that should be fine.
Great, thanks. So hi everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to present here at 24 Hours of STEM. I'm Diana from the University of Sydney, and I graduated just a little over a year ago. I finished my PhD at Professor Jamie Trickus's lab, and he was a fantastic supervisor. As a fairly clumsy and absent-minded person by nature, I got into a lot of mishaps in the lab, but he was so lovely and patient. So definitely check out the TrickyLab Twitter to see the amazing work being done in the lab. Because I'm still pretty new to the field of scientific research, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the path I took before I share what I'm doing now.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah.
Yep. So right now we're not seeing the whole slide screen. We're seeing.
Yeah, gotcha. Let me explain for you.
Yep, that looks better. Yep, thank you.
So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the path I took before I talk to you what I'm doing now. And in high school, I graduated and I pretty much thought, okay, I'm going to study genetics. That was what I planned to do. I was really excited by the elegance of DNA, and I thought it was super cool how everything in our bodies pretty much boiled down to only 4 bases. But what happened next was that I discovered a problem that kept bothering me. And if anyone is looking for their passion or their purpose in life and they're thinking, oh, there's nothing that I really love, I can highly recommend starting with something that bugs you instead, because it can definitely lead you places. It was in my second year of my degree, and I came across a problem that had been around for a long time, but was news to me. And it was a disease that was more than 5,000 years old, that still somehow killed over 4,500 people every day, pretty much in current times. And I thought, what? Why is nobody talking about this? And, tuberculosis is the name of the disease. And it's something that many people think have disappeared from the world. But over 3 billion people are infected right now as we speak. Evidence of tuberculosis has been found in Neolithic human remains and Egyptian mummies. It's believed that Pharaoh Akhenaten, as well as his queen Nefertiti, died of the disease. And in ancient Greece, Hippocrates, as well as Aristotle, wrote about the effects of tuberculosis. It was known as consumption, or the White Plague, in 18th and 19th century Europe. And today, these headlines are just a small sampling of the damage tuberculosis continues to wreak upon the modern world. And the burning question in my mind was, why? So I finished my degree, I left genetics behind, and I applied for a tuberculosis drug discovery project in Professor Jamie's lab for my honors year. Riding on the high of graduation, I thought to myself, okay, this is it. Time for me to have a crack at it. Tuberculosis is going down. And of course, I was hit with reality pretty soon afterwards. So this is the theory of the 4 stages of competence. which is a nice way of outlining how people develop various skills. And I'll tell you now that I went from here to here unbelievably quickly. There were many, many reasons why tuberculosis is still the top killer in the world today, and I really had no clue what I was facing up against. So now I spend all my time between these two stages, and one day may reach for the fourth stage of myth and legend. But nevertheless, I learned a huge amount in my postgraduate studies, and I got to meet and work with so many amazing people in the University of Sydney, as well as Centenary Institute. So now I'm a researcher at the Tuberculosis Research Program at Centenary Institute under the supervision of Professor Warwick Britton. And there's always room in our lab. So if anyone's interested in trying out a summer student program or enrolling in honors, just shoot me an email, just let me know, and we'll see what we can do for you. What I really want to do in this hour is tell you the inside story of drugs and how drugs and vaccines are discovered from the beginning to the end. The main drugs I'll cover in my talk are antibiotics because that was the focus of my research for the past 4 years. We're lucky enough today that we can walk into any pharmacy or chemist and see shelf upon shelf of medication purpose-made to cure whatever ails us. We can get a prescription for antibiotics when we're battling a tough infection or are recovering from surgery. And while many people are probably not as happy to see a needle, both vaccines and antibiotics are critical advances in improving our quality of life. In fact, the US Librarian of Congress ranked vaccines as 5th in a list of top 10 inventions that changed the course of human history, featuring other groundbreaking advances such as the printing press, cars, phones, computers, and of course, the quintessential light bulb. I think this figure really nicely illustrates the impact of antibiotics on deaths from septicemia or blood poisoning. This is from 1910 to 1970, and the data is from Sweden and Finland. And you can see that once the antibiotic sulfanilamide is used on patients, death rates begin to drop pretty much immediately. And then when penicillin comes into the picture, you can see death rates drop down to almost zero. And some of you might be thinking, hang on, penicillin was the first antibiotic ever discovered. It's quite famous for that. And that's true. And it was in 1928, I believe, but it wasn't widely used on patients for quite a while. And so that's why you can see the sulfanilamide data earlier here. This figure shows the effect of chickenpox vaccination on disease incidence in several states of the United States. And again, you can see the decrease in chickenpox cases in all of these states once the 1 dose and then second dose recommendation is implemented for vaccination. Of course, our huge advances in human health are not down to just antibiotics and vaccines. If we have a look at this figure, which shows the combined deaths from all infectious diseases between 1900 and 1996, we can see that implementing a public health system in the form of health departments for 40 of the states, as well as better sanitation and cleaner water, led to a huge reduction in mortality straight away. Everything works together. And if you think about human health, it's important to understand that it's an intersection of education, access to healthcare, public policy, research, and innovation. And this combination that we've reached is something that human history has been working towards for a very long time. So I guess the question is, how did we get to where we are today? And how did we learn to protect ourselves and combat disease effectively? It comes down to, I think, 2 core human instincts: looking at the world around us and asking questions about it. And anyone who spends a lot of time with young children will know for a fact that we were born with these drives. And the more that we nurture them, the more that we can enrich our existence. So I want to take you back all the way to the olden days, before all the important discoveries, and have a look at these questions from that viewpoint so that you can see how far we've come. So imagine we are this perplexed medieval fellow here. And what he observes is that people can become sick and die, And his question is, why? Why does this happen? On the way to answering that question, we do bump into several others. We have to ask ourselves, well, what do we know? What don't we know? What are the gaps in our knowledge? What can we do to resolve these gaps? And what tools and resources do we have at our disposal to help us start addressing these issues? Well, back then, our medieval fellow knew that sickness was suffering and suffering was caused by the devil. And that was the reigning ideology at the time. But they had their church, they had their healing saints, and their king had the healing touch as well, as they believed. So they hoped and they did their best. If we fast forward a bit, however, we can see that the question still stands without a real satisfactory answer. But observations about sickness were more specific now. People now knew that sickness was more common in places with poor hygiene and sanitation, where decomposing food or human waste could be found. So sickness was then believed to be caused by bad smells and bad air. And we know about this because of the posters back then, as well as the ways in which doctors were trying to protect themselves from their patients. We all know that during the Black Death epidemic, doctors wore these masks and they stuck perfume in the beaks in order to protect themselves from the miasmas or the bad smells. And we know that the wealthy people often traveled to the seaside to take in the clean air. Crowded cities tried to keep their streets a bit cleaner, and that no doubt had a positive impact on improving human health as well. And so as you can see, as we get more information, we come closer to a real answer to the question. Today, thanks to the work of John Snow, Louis Pasteur, and Robert Koch, we know that there are two kinds of diseases: infectious and non-infectious. You can't get a non-infectious disease such as cancer, diabetes, or asthma from another person. But infectious diseases are caused by tiny microscopic germs, which we can certainly catch and pass on to others. Well, how did they definitively prove that germs cause disease? Robert Koch wrote a series of rules known as Koch's postulates, and they governed the way you gained the proof for this kind of question and linked a germ or a particular microorganism to a disease. So in his studies, he wanted to prove that a certain bacteria caused anthrax. So what he had to do was first show that every time someone was sick with anthrax, you could find this germ in them. Secondly, he grew the germ in a pure culture and he characterized it, what it looked like, its morphology, what it looked like when it grew on plates and in liquid. And then he took that pure culture and he injected it into a healthy animal. And he showed that after this injection, the animal also fell sick with anthrax. But he wasn't done yet. To complete the links, what he had to do then was then recover that same organism from the sick animal, grow it again, and show that it was the same before and after. And that's how you can definitively link a certain germ with a certain disease. What are germs and how can we combat them? Most people are familiar with the more common types of germs, such as bacteria, which cause tuberculosis and meningitis and strep throat, for example. There are viruses, such as our current COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the common cold and flu. There's fungi, which causes ringworm and athlete's foot and thrush. There's protozoa, little microscopic animals that cause malaria and leishmania disease. There are worms, such as tapeworm or river blindness. And there are prions, which are the smallest of all, and these are responsible for mad cow disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease as well. And the question is, which of these germs do we use antibiotics for? It's bacteria and bacteria only. So if you're ever suffering from a cold or a flu and you're thinking that you need some antibiotics, you do not. Bacterial diseases are the only thing that antibiotics will be effective against. There are many ways to protect ourselves from bacteria. High temperatures will kill bacteria, which is why we sterilize baby bottles with boiling water. Soap doesn't kill bacteria, but it helps wash it away from our skins to prevent our risk of infection. Alcohol is the most common active ingredient in hand sanitizer and will kill bacteria, along with chlorine in swimming pools, bleach, strong acids and bases as well. Our bodies and immune systems also protect us from bacteria. Our skin is a strong natural barrier, which is why we need to bandage our cuts to prevent infection, because the cut has punctured through our skin and it's an opening through which germs can get through. Immune cells will constantly patrol our insides to find and kill any bacteria that manage to make it through our barriers. However, all of this is not foolproof and can fail. Many people have had a bout of food poisoning or a bad sore throat, and these are all due to bacteria bypassing our defenses and multiplying in our bodies. The environment inside us is very warm and very nutrient rich, so there are pretty much ideal conditions for bacteria to grow. So a lot of the time, our immune systems will be able to eventually bring infection under control, but this doesn't always happen. And then without some extra help, we can end up very sick and die. However, this is where antibiotics come into play, because as you can imagine, all of the things that kill bacteria are also not fantastic for us. There is no feasible way you can apply any of these to kill bacteria that are already inside your body without doing yourself harm as well. So one of the earliest antibiotic pioneers, Paul Ehrlich, theorized back in 1900s that it is possible to design a drug to target harmful microbes without hurting the rest of the body. He called this theoretical drug magische Kugel, which translates to a magic ball or a magic bullet, and antibiotics are still nicknamed that today. His lab was the one that actually discovered the first such magic bullet, Salvarsan, but it's not often counted today as the first antibiotic because it was pretty toxic, and a lot of patients actually died upon administration of Salvarsan. What I want to draw your attention to here is this golden age of antibiotic discovery, where we discovered several new classes between 1940 and 1980. In contrast, there has been a desperate antibiotic drought in recent times, as you can see here. Most of what we use today and get from the pharmacist with our prescriptions are variations on the antibiotics discovered 60 or more years ago. And the search for more antibiotics becomes more and more urgent as antibiotic resistance continues to rise. So I'd like to show you all a very good 5-minute video that explains why we're in the middle of an antibiotic crisis and how antibiotic resistance occurs. So hopefully this will work.
Antibiotics. Behind the scenes, they enable much of modern medicine. We use them to cure infectious diseases, but also to safely facilitate everything from surgery to chemotherapy to organ transplants. Without antibiotics, even routine medical procedures can lead to life-threatening infections, and we're at risk of losing them. Antibiotics are chemicals that prevent the growth of bacteria. Unfortunately, some bacteria have become resistant to all currently available antibiotics. At the same time, we've stopped discovering new ones. Still, there's hope that we can get ahead of the problem. But first, how did we get into this situation? The first widely used antibiotic was penicillin, discovered in 1928 by Alexander Fleming. In his 1945 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Fleming warned that bacterial resistance had the potential to ruin the miracle of antibiotics. He was right. In the 1940s and 50s, resistant bacteria already began to appear. From then until the 1980s, pharmaceutical companies countered the problem of resistance by discovering many new antibiotics. At first, this was a highly successful and highly profitable enterprise. Over time, a couple things changed. Newly discovered antibiotics were often only effective for a narrow spectrum of infections, whereas the first ones had been broadly applicable. This isn't a problem in itself, but it does mean that fewer doses of these drugs could be sold, making them less profitable. In the early days, antibiotics were heavily overprescribed. including for viral infections they had no effect on. Scrutiny around prescriptions increased, which is good, but also lowered sales. At the same time, companies began to develop more drugs that are taken over a patient's lifetime, like blood pressure and cholesterol medications, and later antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. Because they are taken indefinitely, these drugs are more profitable. By the mid-1980s, no new chemical classes of antibiotics were discovered, but bacteria continued to acquire resistance and pass it along by sharing genetic information between individual bacteria and even across species. Now, bacteria that are resistant to many antibiotics are common, and increasingly, some strains are resistant to all our current drugs. So, what can we do about this? We need to control the use of existing antibiotics, create new ones, combat resistance to new and existing drugs, and find new ways to fight bacterial infections. The largest consumer of antibiotics is agriculture, which uses antibiotics not only to treat infections, but to promote the growth of food animals. Using large volumes of antibiotics increases the bacteria's exposure to the antibiotics, and therefore their opportunity to develop resistance. Many bacteria that are common in animals, like Salmonella, can also infect humans, and drug-resistant versions can pass to us through the food chain and spread through international trade and travel networks. In terms of finding new antibiotics, nature offers the most promising new compounds. Organisms like other microbes and fungi have evolved over millions of years to live in competitive environments, meaning they often contain antibiotic compounds to give them a survival advantage over certain bacteria. We can also package antibiotics with molecules that inhibit resistance. One way bacteria develop resistance is through proteins of their own that degrade the drug. By packaging the antibiotic with molecules that block the degraders, the antibiotic can do its job. Phages, viruses that attack bacteria but don't affect humans, are one promising new avenue to combat bacterial infections. Developing vaccines for common infections, meanwhile, can help prevent disease in the first place. The biggest challenge to all these approaches is funding, which is woefully inadequate across the globe. Antibiotics are so unprofitable that many large pharmaceutical companies have stopped trying to develop them. Meanwhile, smaller companies that successfully bring new antibiotics to market often still go bankrupt, like the American startup Achaogen. New therapeutic techniques like phages and vaccines face the same fundamental problem as traditional antibiotics. If they're working well, they're used just once, which makes it difficult to make money. And to successfully counteract resistance in the long term, we'll need to use new antibiotics sparingly, lowering the profits for their creators even further. One possible solution is to shift profits away from the volume of antibiotics sold. For example, the United Kingdom is testing a model where healthcare providers purchase antibiotic subscriptions. While governments are looking for ways to incentivize antibiotic development, these programs are still in the early stages. Countries around the world will need to do much more, but with enough investment in antibiotic development and controlled use of our current drugs, we can still get ahead of resistance. On our lives, that the first antibiotic was invented by accident.
Okay. Oops. How do I get
This fascinating.
There we go. So I find that video a very accurate and succinct explanation of the problems facing antibiotic development today. You can see on this graph here that antibiotics and vaccines have the lowest net present value of production for pharmaceutical companies. They're almost a tenth of what a pharmaceutical company would receive for the production of a musculoskeletal drug, such as an arthritis medication, for example. What we have is a situation at present which makes it impossible for pharmaceutical companies to develop antibiotics and still survive. Antibiotics for tuberculosis are particularly troubling because tuberculosis affects some of the poorest regions of the world. Treatment currently involves a combination of up to 4 different antibiotics, and they have to be taken every day for at least 6 months. It's costly, and many sufferers cannot access medication for the length of time required to completely eradicate and cure the disease. Drug-resistant tuberculosis is a huge problem right now too. And there are very, very few antibiotics that can treat it without very negative side effects such as permanent deafness or psychosis. As such, there is a very urgent need to find new antibiotics to shorten and simplify tuberculosis treatment, despite the barriers that are in the way. This problem was my honours project, and I continued to work on it during my PhD as well. The first step to looking for a new antibiotic to TB was asking, where should I begin looking? You know, where do antibiotics come from? And as that video mentioned, antibiotics come largely from nature. In fact, almost all current FDA-approved drugs, not just antibiotics, are derived from bacteria, fungi, or plants, and all of the current antibiotics are derived from nature as well. Plants are very well studied, and soil bacteria and fungi have been under intense investigation since the 1960s. So I thought, what else could I try? You know, where else in nature might antibiotics be found, different ones, new ones, to help us deal with this problem? And the answer was the ocean. An estimated 25% of all of Earth's biodiversity is comprised of marine species, and over 3 quintillion microorganisms live in the marine environment. That's 3 times 10 to the power of 30. And furthermore, these marine microorganisms are able to produce chemicals and metabolites that are completely distinct to what's made by terrestrial species. And all of this makes the ocean a very prime, untapped source of novel antibiotics. We teamed up with the Australian Institute of Marine Science and were able to access the collection of samples from the Great Barrier Reef for this project. The Marine Science Institute is located off the coast of Cairns in Queensland, and they maintain a huge bioresources library by scuba diving on the reef, bringing back and cataloguing samples. They also operate enormous bioreactor tanks for growing coral and other reef organisms, which is super cool. In the end, they sent me around 1,500 different marine extracts, all frozen in little vials. And these came from a whole array of soft-bodied organisms such as sea sponges, sea squirts, stingers, and worms. What I had to do next was decide on a series of tests to narrow down the 1,500 samples to the best possible candidates for a new antibiotic for tuberculosis. And you can probably guess what the first question is. Does the extract kill the bacteria that causes tuberculosis? And the second question is pretty obvious as well. Does the extract kill human cells? Because what we're looking for is an effective but safe antibiotic, not something that's broadly toxic and will kill everything in sight. What I did was I used plates that allowed me to test 96 samples at a time to speed things up. And I grew the same amount of bacteria in every well of each plate, and then added the same concentration of each different marine extract. So there was 1 marine extract per well. I left them to grow for 7 days. And the idea was that if the marine extract was active, the bacteria would not multiply to the extent that if it was inactive. So the wells containing active drugs would not have a lot of bacteria in them. So it's hard to quantify the amounts of bacteria in these wells because they are microscopic. So in order to do so quickly and easily, I used a color-changing chemical called Resazurin. So when you add Resazurin to each well of these 96 well plates, it changes from dark blue to hot pink if there are living cells in there. So if that's the case, if the bacteria are dead, it stays dark blue. So it's a very easy way to tell which extracts are active and which ones are not. This is one of my plates from the experiment, and you can see that there are a couple of active extracts dotted around here and a whole bunch more that didn't work. And in fact, that's what we found. We found that out of the 1,500 marine samples, which are all here represented by 1 dot each, and this is the bacterial survival, you can see that most of them stay at about 100%. So the marine extracts that we used did not manage to inhibit their growth at all. So what I did was I marked all of these samples that were able to reduce bacterial survival less than 50% as the interesting ones for further investigation. To test for toxicity, I did pretty much the same thing, but instead of growing bacteria in the wells of the 96 well plates, I grew human cells instead. And so if it was pink, that was good. It meant that the extract was non-toxic. But if everything turned out blue, then it's not fantastic. Whatever the extract is doing is also killing human cells as well. I checked 3 different types of human cells. I checked lung cells, immune cells, and kidney cells, and I made graphs of their survival. And if any extract reduced survival, for any of these cell lines, I discounted it from further investigation. The next important question for any drug discovery project is, how strong is the extract? How much do I need to use to kill the bacteria? And this is important because you don't want to be having to give patients bucket loads of medication every single day. So the more potent the extract, the better it is. In order to test this, I kept reducing the amount of marine extract I added to the bacteria by half, and then looked at what happened to bacterial survival. So you can see that some extracts stop working pretty much as soon as you reduce their concentration by half, but some of them keep working at very tiny concentrations. And that's what you want to see. These potent compounds here, you can quantify their potency using the minimum inhibitory concentration, which is the lowest concentration at which you can get a reduction in survival below 50%. And the lower the MIC is, the better your drug candidate, pretty much. The next question I looked at is one of the reasons why tuberculosis is so hard to treat. The bacteria that causes tuberculosis hides inside lung cells, which makes it very hard for antibiotics to reach them. So I wanted to see if any of the marine extracts could overcome this problem. To do that, I infected human lung cells with the tuberculosis bacteria, and then I added the marine extracts of interest, and I left them for 7 days. And at the end, I lysed the lung cells, which basically means just to pop them open to release the bacteria that's still inside them, and then I quantified the amount of bacteria. And so you can see the blue column here is your untreated lung cells. And they have a lot of bacteria in them because pretty much the bacteria were allowed to just go for it without any inhibitors added. I added high, medium, and low concentrations of the same extracts just to see if we got a response depending on how much extract we added. And you can see that at the higher concentrations, we get a good reduction in bacterial loads inside the lung cells. But as you reduce the concentration, as expected, the bacterial growth increases again. Question 5 is another reason why tuberculosis is hard to treat. Not only can the bacteria hide inside lung cells, but it can also hibernate like a bear in winter. It drops its metabolism down really low, and this makes it essentially bulletproof. We don't call it hibernation, but a state of latency. And in order to test whether my marine extracts would work against latent tuberculosis bacteria, what I had to do was to force the bacteria into a state of latency. And I did that by adding nitric oxide into the plates where they were growing. So once that was done and they were in that state, I added the marine extracts, I waited, and then counted to see the numbers of bacteria that were left after the treatment. So what you can see here is that over time, the numbers of bacteria don't change. They're not growing, and that's because they are latent. So that tells us that the nitric oxide is doing its job. And on this side, you can see the extracts that, even though they worked on normally growing tuberculosis bacteria, they've stopped working here. We don't see any reduction in the numbers of bacteria after treatment, after 7 days of treatment or 4 days of treatment. However, a couple of the extracts still managed to work. Okay, and you can see how they've reduced our loads of bacteria, and it's a bit of a drop in day 4, and then we get more of a drop in day 7, except for this particular compound, which caused a little kick up. So it seems to have lost efficacy over the course of the 7 days. Finally, I also looked at whether any of the marine extracts could kill drug-resistant bacteria, because that would be the real bonus here in terms of drug discovery. You know, shortening treatment is one thing, but combating drug-resistant tuberculosis is another huge priority in this field. So what we did was test them against clinical isolates of tuberculosis that we took from patients at Westmead Hospital. And this is a sample plate. This particular strain was resistant to isoniazid, one of the main TB drugs. And you can tell that it is because this column was treated with isoniazid, but as you can see, it comes out pink. So all the bacteria there are very happy, they're actively growing, and so the residuum turns pink. Here, on the other hand, are our marine extracts. And you can see that they've managed to kill this resistant strain. And this is great because what it tells us is that whatever we've got is something new. It's something different. It's not working the same way as the drugs that we already have, which is very promising. So this was an exciting result. So just to recap, I started with 1,500 marine extracts. And by the time I finished all the rounds of testing, can you guess how many I had left? It's like a series of hurdles. It's just the survival of the fittest kind of competition here as they get eliminated one by one. And the answer is I had 1. I only had 1 sample left in the end that managed to make it through the whole gauntlet. It came from a sea sponge. It was a Tadania sea sponge extract. And I did a lot of work to purify the sea sponge extract because it was basically a crude mixture. What the Marine Institute had done was take the whole sponge and basically grind it and render it down into a powder. And I used that powder to basically test against all of these different screens. So it contains thousands of different components, and we weren't sure which one was the active one. So we did a lot of purification using HPLC, and then we did the identification process using NMR, and I ended up with the chemical that was responsible for the antibiotic activity. I then had to repeat all the experiments that I just showed you with this pure compound just to confirm that the activity remained the same. And the crazy thing is that all of these experiments were only the very beginning of the antibiotic drug discovery journey. What I did was just the preclinical stage. And then after that, new drugs must go through 4 different phases of clinical trials in larger and larger groups of people to prove that they're safe and that they work. It has been estimated that the time, the effort, the resources, and the funding that go into the development of a new drug is $2.6 billion US. The cost of human clinical trials alone is $19 million US. The time it takes normally from the beginning of discovery to FDA approval is around 12 years on average, but it can take up to 20 years. And FDA approval is not guaranteed either because the most recent statistics show us that FDA approval rates are currently less than 12%. So it's perhaps no wonder that many pharmaceutical companies are giving up altogether. Archaeogen, which was the company mentioned in the video that I showed you, did very well, and they managed to develop a new antibiotic for a drug-resistant strain of bacteria that was causing major problems in hospitals. And in their first year after they launched it, they made barely $1 million in profit. So if you can imagine that if they're putting out this much time and this much money, they had no choice but to be declared bankrupt in the end. So we have an environment that really does, in a sense, punish antibiotic discovery. But anyway, hopefully things will get better. And having taken you through the drug discovery process, I'm going to switch over to the vaccine side of things now. Vaccines work very differently to antibiotics. So we know that antibiotics kill bacteria which have infected our bodies, but what vaccines do is prevent us from becoming infected in the first place. And as the old proverb goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Immunity is an invaluable weapon for combating infectious diseases. And we can clearly see that with regards to the current COVID-19 situation, where 120 labs around the world are frantically working to develop an effective vaccine to halt the spread of disease, get the world moving again, and pretty much let us get our lives back on track. As an introduction to the topic of vaccines, I'd like to show you this 4-minute video on the eradication of smallpox, a deadly and disfiguring disease that no longer exists today.
10,000 years ago, a deadly virus arose in northeastern Africa. The virus spread through the air, attacking the skin cells, bone marrow, spleen, and lymph nodes of its victims. The unlucky infected developed fevers, vomiting, and rashes. 30% of infected people died during the second week of infection. Survivors bore scars and scabs for the rest of their lives. Smallpox had arrived. In 1350 BC, the first smallpox epidemics hit during the Egypt-Hittite War. Egyptian prisoners spread smallpox to the Hittites, which killed their king and devastated his civilization. Insidiously, smallpox made its way around the world via Egyptian merchants, then through the Arab world with the Crusades, and all the way to the Americas with the Spanish and Portuguese conquests. Since then, it has killed billions of people, with an estimated 300 to 500 million people killed in the 20th century alone. But smallpox is not unbeatable. In fact, the fall of smallpox started long before modern medicine. It began all the way back in 1022 AD. According to a small book called The Correct Treatment of Smallpox, a Buddhist nun living in a famous mountain named Ome Shan in the southern province of Sichuan would grind up smallpox scabs and blow the powder into nostrils of healthy people. She did this after noticing that those who managed to survive smallpox never got it again. And her odd treatment worked. The procedure, called variolation, slowly evolved, and by the 1700s, doctors were taking material from sores and putting them into healthy people through 4 or 5 scratches on the arm. This worked pretty well, as inoculated people would not get reinfected, but it wasn't foolproof. Up to 3% of people would still die after being exposed to the pus. It wasn't until English physician Edward Jenner noticed something interesting about dairy maids that we got our modern solution. At age 13, while Jenner was apprenticed to a country surgeon and apothecary in Sodbury, near Bristol, he heard a dairymaid say, "I shall never have smallpox, for I have had cowpox. I shall never have an ugly pockmarked face." Cowpox is a skin disease that resembles smallpox and infects cows. Later on, as a physician, he realized that she was right. Women who got cowpox didn't develop the deadly smallpox. Smallpox and cowpox viruses are from the same family. But when a virus infects an unfamiliar host, in this case cowpox infecting a human, it is less virulent. So Jenner decided to test whether the cowpox virus could be used to protect against smallpox. In May 1796, Jenner found a young dairymaid, Sarah Nelms, who had fresh cowpox lesions on her hand and arm, caught from the udders of a cow named Blossom. Using matter from her pustules, he inoculated James Phipps, the 8-year-old son of his gardener. After a few days of fever and discomfort, the boy seemed to recover. 2 months later, Jenner inoculated the boy again, this time with matter from a fresh smallpox lesion. No disease developed, and Jenner concluded that protection was complete. His plan had worked. Jenner later used the cowpox virus in several other people and challenged them repeatedly with smallpox, proving that they were immune to the disease. With this procedure, Jenner invented the smallpox vaccination. Unlike variolation, which used actual smallpox virus to try to protect people, vaccination used the far less dangerous cowpox virus. The medical establishment, cautious then as now, deliberated at length over his findings before accepting them. But eventually, vaccination was gradually accepted, and variolation became prohibited in England in 1840. After large vaccination campaigns throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the World Health Organization certified smallpox's eradication in 1979. Jenner is forever remembered as the father of immunology. But let's not forget the dairymaid Sarah Nelms, Blossom the cow, and James Phipps, all heroes in this great adventure of vaccination, who helped eradicate smallpox.
Okay, So hopefully I can go to the next slide smoothly. Nope, there we go. So the eradication of smallpox is one of the greatest successes of modern medicine. So I hope you all enjoyed that video. It mentioned that Edward Jenner is the father of immunology. And to really understand how vaccines work, we need to know how our immune system works. We touched upon this very briefly earlier, but I'll go into more detail now. The first thing you need to know is that immunology is all about attack and defense. Infection is a battle for survival, and germs create toxins and capsules to protect themselves and use adhesins to help them enter our bodies. We have